Okay, thanks very much, Meredith, and thanks to Trina and to Melissa for organizing this. Very, very enthused about the day and what we can accomplish. So I was asked to say a few things about the role of the CCA-PAC, particularly from the respect of research and what involvement do we have. There's sort of three areas I want to cover with respect to that. And I want to also raise a few questions perhaps and stimulate some thinking about where we should be going. So, just see if I can get this thing working. Okay. So, as I think a lot of you might know, one of the major involvements that CCA has in research is that there are some granting awards that we annually adjudicate. There's the Dr. J. Campbell Research Award, which is a $25,000 research grant, and there's a Young Investigator Award to stimulate younger researchers to get involved in celiac research, hopefully as a starting point to something that evolves in the future. As I say, there's an annual call for these. The role of the PAC is to review all of these applications, to adjudicate them. Everybody on the PAC is involved in adjudicating all of the projects, and it's very helpful because we have quite a multidisciplinary group. We have dietitians, we have physicians, we have scientists, and so everybody comes with their perspective. And this allows us to evaluate these projects, and it's really quite a diverse spectrum. So it ranges from basic science, and we have representation from that on the panel today, to clinical issues that really are bedside issues, and there are epidemiologic studies as well. So it really covers that spectrum. I think that over the years, these awards have funded many Canadian research and research groups, and I'm a beneficiary myself of that, and it's definitely had a major impact on starting projects and even getting preliminary data that you can apply to other areas, other granting agencies to get research. I think it's stimulated young researchers. Jocelyn, I'm going to put you in that category. And I think that in Canada, this is really the one area, celiac-specific area, that you can apply for grants with. And a lot of other areas, or a lot of other granting agencies, celiac is mixed in with other disciplines, so in gastroenterology, things like inflammatory bowel disease and cancer, and sometimes the competition, those have a bit of higher profile, so it's difficult to compete in that setting. So this is really a great advantage for us. So this is sort of the one area, as I say, that we're involved with, and just have a bit of a delay in this. There we go. So I think there are a few things that are worth considering. We have many unanswered questions in celiac disease. What are the themes that should be prioritized when we call for proposals? What are the things that we should emphasize as in Canada specifically that we think we can answer? I think we should think beyond what we have. These research awards, by the way, were initially started in 1992. Was when this fund was developed, so it's been going for quite a while. I think one of the challenges that we have in celiac disease research is, can we consider funding larger projects that are for multi-years. So these are projects that might have more impact, but also require more resources. And what we haven't done with these awards is partner with industry. So can we leverage the funds we have with industry to try and enhance what we're doing with these awards? So I think we have places to go with these with the J. Campbell Research Award. And that's sort of one of the first areas that we deal with. The second area is that there is research that gets generated from the PAC itself. And I think this was a survey that was done now, it was published in 2007, but it was started many years before that, which surveyed the entire database of the Canadian Celiac Association. And again, one of our advantages in Canada is we have everybody in one group. Dan Leffler and I were just talking about the fact that in the US it's a bit more fragmented. We have everybody in one group, and that's a big advantage. So this was a very big undertaking in terms of the survey, and I think a very powerful survey that was generated by the PAC. In addition, there was another questionnaire that was developed in conjunction with the FQMC, and again, these surveys lead to presentations at scientific meetings and also to publications, which creates some profile and also allows us to disseminate some of the information that is generated from these. So I think this is a second role of the PAC is developing research proposals. Again, the questions that I would say is what should the PAC take on with respect to celiac disease research? Who we have on our PAC, as I say, includes physicians, scientists, dietitians at this point. What resources should be used to fund this? Should this research extend beyond questionnaires? Should we be collaborating with other academic institutions in research? And again, what are the research areas we might target? The last sort of area which I would consider research, and that is that the PAC develops position statements and publications. And again, there are different levels you can do this with. You can do systematic reviews, you can do meta-analyses. We don't take them to that level. That is a very intense level. But what we will do is we'll tackle perhaps controversial issues. We'll sometimes tackle common issues. This is an example of two publications, one quite recently that looked at some issues. One was home blood testing when that first came on, and we thought that primary care physicians might be confused about the role of that. And again, the PAC developed a sort of a review of that was published in the Canadian Family Physician Journal, so accessed by Canadian family physicians. More recently, bone health was a topic that we thought was important, so we again published in the same journal, accessed by primary care physicians to give them some information about how to manage that. And so I think this is another area that has potential for the PAC, and the PAC does this. We've done some guidelines on oats and published that in the Canadian Journal of Gastroenterology. I think it's one of those things that the advantages of this are that, again, it's widely disseminated, so it's a way of getting education out to different healthcare professionals. They're in peer-reviewed journals, so this is credible and accessible material. And it's also, we usually populate it on the website, so it's even accessible by individuals in the association as well. I think once again, the questions this raises to me is, again, what are the areas that we should be addressing? We've tackled sort of controversial areas or areas where there's some confusion, we think. We have to be a bit careful because there are some areas that are controversial because we don't have evidence. And so we have to be careful that this isn't evidence-based. We're very evidence-based focused on the PAC, and we want to be true to that evidence. We've been talking about clinical practice guidelines from a Canadian perspective, and we've talked about collaborating with the Canadian Association of Gastroenterology, and that's something that's still that's in the works that we're pursuing. So, in summary, I think the PAC, it's the J. Campbell Award that usually gets a lot of the focus with respect to research, and it will continue to be so, and I wonder what we can do to expand that and enhance that. And we also want to continue to be involved perhaps in research that we generate based on relevant questions. It's a matter of identifying those questions and questions that are answerable by our group, and then lastly, continuing to be involved in some of these position statements, et cetera. So I'll leave that for now, and we can take it from there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So the next presenter is Dr. Elena Verdu, who is, among many other things, I believe, Professor of Division of Gastroenterology at McMaster University. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. So I was tasked with telling you about my research in the past 10 years in 10 minutes. So I will take 1 minute per year. So let's start. So I thought that perhaps I would give you as way of background why I started to do research in celiac disease 10 years ago, or a little bit more. And one of the reasons is that the mechanisms of disease in celiac disease are fascinating. It's really a unique disorder. Think about it, it's the only autoimmune condition where we know what the trigger is, and that passage between your normal intestine to the one on the right is atrophy. we can actually reverse that because we know what the antigen is. So, for example, if we take gluten and you do a proper gluten-free diet, most of you are going to enter in remission, and that's unique for an autoimmune disorder. The other unique condition is that we know exactly how that trigger links with your genes to induce risk for celiac disease. So that's fascinating. I can tell you celiac disease is a model GI disorder, and more gastroenterologists should be interested in this, more than in IBD and IBS, because we understand so much about mechanisms of disease, and we could learn so much from the other conditions by understanding celiac disease. The other reason is that celiac disease is dynamic, and it has changed enormously in these past decades. And one of the things is that huge increase in prevalence, right? And in fact, that's due mainly to new diagnosis, because we have learned about the mechanisms of disease. We have learned what tissue transglutaminase to what the role is in celiac disease, and then we have been able to develop a serological test that is really diagnosing properly celiac disease. However, there is another factor why that curve is going up, and it's that its prevalence of celiac disease is truly increasing. So if we go back to the past 40 years, and you can see the curve on the right, celiac disease is increasing in the same way that allergic diseases is increasing, or autoimmune conditions like, for example, type 1 diabetes. So that begs the question, if you are a researcher, why? Why is this disease increasing in prevalence? So there are unanswered questions. And so think about it, the general population, that's the gray circle, then you have that light blue. These are most of populations in the world carrying the celiac disease genes, and however that blue center there, the minority of those are the ones that develop celiac disease. So prevalence is increasing. Not everyone that has the genes have the disease. So really, what are these unknown environmental factors? And that's something we can't let go when we are researchers. So you know very well that most of these environmental factors, the focus has been on the first two, right? On early life, modification of introduction of gluten to the diet. Well, we've had the large studies that show that it doesn't matter too much what we do in early life with respect to gluten, at least if you have high risk. There are other unknown environmental factors that we need to go after. And really the microbial factors have emerged as one of those unknown factors. And this has been really the unsolved question that I tackled about a decade ago. And because I'm a basic researcher, I want to know about the mechanisms. And the last reason probably is that, as you all know, we have unmet needs in celiac disease, and one of them is treatment. We have a good thing, which is the gluten-free diet, but that's not a therapy. That's the best way we can manage it, but we have to do better. So no pharmacological therapy. If we understand mechanisms, maybe we can do something about it. So that's why, and now we go into what I did about 10 years ago. I thought in order to study mechanisms of disease, you have to understand, you have to go to animal models. And so I'm going to tell you, we used a model. We started to develop a model where we express, it's a humanized model because we express the celiac genes in those mice. And we also take out all the bacteria from the gut, and now we can put good or bad guys that come from patients with celiac disease or from healthy people. And so that's what we did, and we were very surprised to see that if we put, let's say, commensals, normal bugs, without any pathogens, we didn't see any changes, any damage in those mice if we gave them gluten. But if we put the bad bugs that we took from patients with certain patients with celiac disease, we could see some damage. So this was funded by an award, a J.C. Campbell Award, and it was really the seed money that allowed me to establish this model and then do further research. And so that's what took me to investigate, so can bacteria actually digest gluten? So is this a possible mechanism? And if so, our patients with celiac disease, do they have a different kind of digestion of gluten depending on the bugs they have? So I'm really making this very, very simple, but this is what we did through really 10 years of research. We started in the patients, we obtained their bugs, we cultured them, we did metabolize, experiments with the different bugs that we isolated from the celiac patients. We characterized the peptides that were being produced, and then we went back to the animal models and to the clinical trial. So impossible to tell you all this in one slide, but probably you get an idea of how long it took. And this is my last slide. And so this is the concept I want to pass throughout those 10 years. And this has now been published in Gastroenterology, which is the top journal of our field, and in Nature Communications. And again, this was supported by a fellowship to one of my postdocs. So you do have that digestion, and the little orange dots, that would be the gluten peptides after you have a meal with gluten. And that's digested by your enzymes, your digestive enzymes. But what we found was that if you have certain pathogen bugs in your gut, those pathogens can intervene in gluten digestion in the intestine. And they produce those a little bit green, shorter peptides that transfer very well through the barrier. And they are still immunogenic. However, the concept of sequential microbial metabolism, where if you add other metabolizers like lactobacillus that we can get from healthy people, and not all, but some, you can then better metabolize those peptides. And then we don't have the immunogenic peptides, we have just amino acids that are absorbed. And that could reduce risk to celiac disease. So that was the concept that emerged during these 10 years. And with that, I'd like to thank all the people in my lab because they did all the job. And thank you and the CCA for giving me that seed support that allowed me to get the NCHR and other federal funding that wouldn't have been possible without that first support. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm not sure how many other diagrams are going to show up, but so I just wanted to check with the panel. So Dan, I see you're standing, but does it make sense for you to go next, or I had Dr. Sylvester next in terms of sequence? Should we arm wrestle? Yeah, no. Okay, thank you. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Jocelyn Sylvester, who, among many other things, is a pediatric gastroenterologist at Boston Children's Hospital. So thanks. Welcome to Toronto.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to go home. I fly back and forth between Nunavut and Manitoba and Boston very often, and so it was very exciting to actually not connect at Pearson and actually get off. Now, how does this move forward? The big green button? There we go. Okay. So some disclosures, which I think are exciting because these are companies, and it's only been very recently that we've really had a lot of industry interest in celiac disease. Not especially relevant today, although sitting here, Dr. Leffler has said to me at least half a dozen times, talk about the doggy bag study, talk about the doggy bag study. Although that was not the initial plan, I will talk briefly about it. So I think one of the things that we struggle with in celiac disease as researchers in trying to study celiac disease is this notion that celiac disease is a solved problem. People get sick, their villi are short, we take the gluten away, they feel better, and their villi grow back. Now, if only life were really like this. So I think we need to interrogate a little further. Do people really feel better, and do their villi really get better? And I think sometimes we can learn a lot by going back. So this is a figure from Dickey's thesis where he really showed that a gluten-free diet is helpful for celiac disease. This is a height growth chart on a child who was diagnosed just before 1 year of age. And so age is on the bottom, height is on the y-axis. And you can see that height doesn't go in a nice straight line, but it kind of goes flat, goes up a bit, goes flat, goes up a bit. And you can see on the bottom some bars because this patient was admitted to hospital and given a gluten-free diet and grew. And then when the patient was discharged, they stopped growing. And then when they kept them in hospital but let them go to school during the day, they stopped growing. And really, this tells us, I think, all we need to know about a gluten-free diet for celiac disease, which is that it works great in controlled situations, but life's not like that. And so this is where I'll talk briefly about the doggy bag. I didn't put any slides in, but this is a study that we recently completed with our Manitoba Celiac cohort, where we had our patients collect doggy bags of food and stool and urine over a 10-day period, and we tested them all for gluten. And we found that these patients who have been in a research study for 2 years, are very knowledgeable about a gluten-free diet, adherent to a gluten-free diet. 12 of 18 had detectable gluten exposures within that 10-day period, and most didn't suspect the exposure, and most had normal TTGs. And there wasn't a great correlation between gluten exposure and biopsy results. If you want to hear more about it, I'm happy to talk to you about it, but I was instructed not to talk too much about that today, so I don't want to get too sidetracked. So this is data, which is from Canadian Celiac Association Celiac Health Survey, looking at the impact of celiac disease and a gluten-free diet on Canadian kids, basically showing that there's morbidity of a gluten-free diet. It's not going to kill you, but it's not going to make you happy. And so I assert that celiac disease is not a solved problem because we're not necessarily making our patients feel better, and we're not necessarily getting them better. So this is some data which is out of Boston. On the on the left you have pediatric data, on the right you have adult data looking at patients with so-called non-responsive celiac disease. These are people who are on a gluten-free diet but don't feel better or still have a high TTG. Not surprisingly, gluten exposure is a common cause, but there's lots of other causes in there, and I think it's especially important to note in both groups we have a proportion of people with eating disorders. And I think this is probably partly as a consequence of a gluten-free diet, and it's something that's not very well studied, but again, part of the morbidity of this treatment that doesn't work anyway. So this is a meta-analysis looking at mucosal recovery, and so you have age on the bottom again, and then how many have vellus atrophy when they're rebiopsied. And this is a meta-analysis, so people have been on a gluten-free diet for different lengths of time and were diagnosed at different ages. But you can see the top of the y-axis is 80%, and we're not even reaching, it is 80%. And the best we get is in the 3-year-old age group, only 10% are having persistent vellus atrophy. And the more we do more biopsies, even in Finland, where they claim they have a great gluten-free diet, the more we're finding vellus atrophy. And so I think that begs a couple questions. We know the treatment's not very good, but what should our endpoint be? Are we stuck? So I was asked primarily to speak about monitoring patients on a gluten-free diet. And I think this really classically falls into 2 categories, although you could argue there should be 3. And one is, have we gotten the gluten away, which I think is very treatment specific and really doesn't necessarily apply if we're talking about treatments that are an alternative to a gluten-free diet. The other is the patient getting better? So if we think about these very broadly, this is me in clinic, this is what I do on a Thursday morning, see my patients, are you following a strict gluten-free diet? 95% of people say yes. 95% of people on the Canadian Celiac Health Survey will say yes. And then I say, well, when were you last exposed to gluten? And they'll tell me, well, you know, last week I was at a birthday party or whatever. And so patients may conceive that they're on a strict gluten-free diet, but when you start questioning, you realize that actually they're getting gluten, or at least they think they're getting gluten. They're probably not very good at knowing if they're getting gluten, but we're working on figuring that out. So how do we monitor celiac disease in the clinic? And I said the clinic because we don't really have much better tools for research studies, but this is really practically what we're doing. So we really do 2 things. One is diet adherence, which is often asking a lot of questions, which is very limited because it's limited by the participants' knowledge and their awareness, and the knowledge and awareness of the interviewer. There's some standardized assessments, all are limited, and dietitians often get involved. And then there's also these gluten immunogenic peptides, which are what we use for the doggy bag study. And basically the idea here is Dr. Verdu showed you that the gut doesn't digest gluten fully, and so you can detect that in stool. You can also detect it in urine. So it's kind of like the teenager with the pregnancy test. If I say, look, you know, there's some gluten in your urine, there's really only one way it got there, and that's through the mouth. So sometimes having them pee on a stick gets you information that you really wouldn't get otherwise and gets you to the root of the problem. But really, anything to do with diet adherence is just kind of a circular loop about the treatment and doesn't really get to the disease. And so on the other hand, we have measures of what you would call disease activity or immune activation, We have antibodies of various kinds, very good for diagnosis, not so good and not approved for follow-up. Part of the reason why they're not good is that decreasing your gluten intake tends to have your antibody level decrease and doesn't necessarily correlate with whether your intestine looks better. And so that's why, particularly for research studies, we're doing a lot of intestinal biopsies. I'd argue that we really don't know the best way to interpret these biopsies. And so although that's really our gold standard, it's not really that shiny. So to put this into sort of perspective, we're kind of asking people about behavior, and then we're trying to query biology. You notice I didn't talk about symptoms because I am not sure where symptoms fall in. Are they a manifestation of disease? Are they a behavior? In looking at our Manitoba celiac cohort, we see that there's more symptoms in people on a gluten-free diet than the general population. If we look at like IBS or functional dyspepsia, is this going to get better over time? I don't know. Is it celiac disease? Is it something else? We don't know. I'm not really sure how much symptoms are going to help us. So what are some of the unanswered questions? And I think they're so basic, I only have one slide. So what is the treatment goal in celiac disease? What are we actually trying to achieve? Is it for people to feel better? Is it for their antibodies to get normal, their antibodies to get undetectable? Is it for their intestine to look normal if we biopsy them? And then I think something that's really important that we don't really know the answer to is what is the cause of what we say persistent villus atrophy? These people who, when we biopsy them after 2 years, 5 years, 10 years on a gluten-free diet, still have damage in their intestine. Is this a manifestation of intermittent gluten exposures? Is this because some people aren't going to get better with, quote, just a gluten-free diet? We don't really know, and I think that's a really important question. So I would argue, and I think Dr. Loeffler is going to help us with this in his talk, that celiac disease is not a solved problem, but a problem to be solved. And the solution is not a gluten-free diet, it's something better. So I wanted to say thank you to my various collaborators and the folks that have supported me, which is all those logos along the bottom. I was asked to include some anecdotes, so I have a slide that kind of tells you what's behind this. Oh, sorry. And so this is, since I started my PhD, research funding that I've gotten either from my salary or directly for projects. This is a small fraction of the actual cost of training me. I'm now like an early stage investigator after 20 years of post-secondary education and a couple years of faculty. This is over $2 million, and really, as I said, is only a fraction of the cost, and I'm just one researcher. I think the things to highlight are, oh, sorry, go backwards. That I did my PhD first, which was completely unrelated to celiac disease. I really wanted to study intestinal bacteria. This was a few years ago before we really knew about the microbiome, before Dr. Verdu was even involved in celiac disease. And my mentor was a gastroenterologist, Dr. Rashid, who I think many of you know, who recommended that I get involved in celiac disease and said, you know, the Celiac Association has this Young Investigator Award. Why don't we apply for it and we can find out what's going on with follow-up? So we did that. And then I went to residency in Manitoba, which is where I met Dr. Dirksen. And I think I made a mistake here because he offered me this project. He's like, you know, I'm doing these really interesting things in osteoporosis. And I said, well, you know, I'm really interested in follow-up, and I'd love to do a study, but there really is not great data for follow-up. So we decided to do a prospective study, which led to applying for another J. Campbell Award for the Manitoba Celiac cohort, which helped us get CIHR funding for the Manitoba Celiac cohort. And really, now, by this time, I'm known for celiac disease, so if I were to stand up and talk about inflammatory bowel disease, people would be a little bit confused. So I think the anecdote here is it's important to study young researchers because then you get people in, and some of them are going to stay. More recently, I've gotten a grant from the Celiac Disease Foundation, which again is probably going to be seed money for a bigger NIH grant, which is the anecdote that small grants are important because they get things started. You've already heard that from Dr. Verdu. And then I now have NIH funding for a career development award. So it's a big investment: time, money, blood, sweat, tears, all of it.
Thank you very much. Also, an excellent use of diagrams and visuals. So our next presenter is Dr. Dan Loeffler, who, among the other hats he wears, is the celiac of the Celiac Center at Beth Israel and the medical director of Takeda Pharmaceuticals. Thank
Thank you.
So the great thing about working with Jocelyn is she does most of your work for you. Unfortunately, when you're speaking after her, she already said most of the things I was going to say. So pluses and minuses. But it's great to be back at the CCA. I always love coming to speak here. And I think the CCA has for so long set a standard and a great example for organizations really around the world of what you can accomplish in celiac disease, all the way from foundational education to supporting researchers to working with government, really all the functions that we would expect of an excellent organization. So I'm not going to go through a lot of this. In fact, maybe I'll just leave it up while I talk about some other things. But when I started in celiac disease 15 or so years ago in the clinic, I really started for a lot of the same reasons Elena mentioned about it really being scientifically a fascinating and unique disorder where you can gain a lot of insights. But I think I was laboring under the sort of misperception that I think most physicians maybe still have, is that really clinically it wasn't that much to do because we had already been fixed, right? And this was what Jocelyn said about being a solved problem. And I was a bit surprised and maybe disappointed to learn when I started a celiac clinic that I was getting lots of people coming in to see me not because they were fine, but because they weren't fine. And this idea of, oh, why are people with celiac disease when we know about the gluten-free diet not doing well has really driven my career over the last 15 to 20 years and taken me into this road of therapies, which I'm going to talk to you about in a little bit. But I think what we've learned, and I think we have a lot to learn about why people aren't doing well, I think there are a couple sort of big take-homes, big axes of understanding how patients recover, how patients don't recover, that are worth pointing out. One of these is gluten exposure, and Jocelyn mentioned this. This doggy bag study, I think is going to be a landmark study because it really is a very rigorous assessment of gluten exposure in a best-case scenario. I mean, you're not going to find more adherent people than Canadians who are participating in a celiac disease gluten-free trial, taken care of by top physicians and dietitians, are still getting exposed almost on a weekly basis. So actually, I think the gluten-free diet is actually a pretty awful term. There is no such thing as a gluten-free diet. There's only a gluten-restricted diet. And for some people, it's enough, and for some people, it's not. So we have this one axis of gluten exposure. It's never zero. Some people, it's a little more. Some people, it's a little less. The other axis we have is immunosensitivity. So how reactive you are to gluten. And we know, and again, this used to be a one-size-fits-all thing. You know, everyone goes gluten-free and everyone gets better. We know now that there's an incredible heterogeneity in how people respond to gluten. You take some people and you give them teeny amounts of gluten and they get very sick and intestinal damage very quickly. I can take other people at a clinical trial and give them slices of bread a day, grams and grams of gluten for weeks at a time, and nothing happens. They feel fine. Their intestine looks fine. So we know celiac disease is not this single, everyone fits in this one box. It's a really very heterogeneous, and we don't really understand why that is. And maybe that's something that'll come up in the panel discussion. It's probably some combination of your microbiome and your genes, and maybe some other things we really don't know about. But it's not one disease. People need to be treated differently, just like we do for every other disease. I mean, we don't take everyone with type 1 diabetes and give them the same dose of insulin and say, go on your way. This is really an old paradigm. The other thing which relates to symptoms, which is really sort of the big black box, is visceral sensitivity. So people have very different abilities to respond to sensation in their gut. And we know this even without celiac disease. You see, I'm sure you all have friends who, they eat a little bit they get a little spice in their food, even without celiac disease, and they're bowled over in pain. And other people go and eat street food in Asia, and they're just walking around happy. So we know even people without GI diseases respond very different to GI sensation. And so if you put all those three together, I think you get the variety of results we see in celiac disease on a gluten-free diet. And some people do fine, and some really need something more than the diet. I think the diet will always be our foundation, but it is very clear now that a substantial proportion of people's diet is just not enough. And just telling people to work harder and stop cheating is not the answer. So thanks to the work of a lot of wonderful lab scientists like Dr. Verdu, we know enough about celiac disease to really target the pathophysiology. Unlike a lot of other immune diseases where we just sort of hit the immune system with a big hammer, like we do in rheumatoid arthritis or inflammatory bowel disease, we can actually target specific parts of celiac disease pathogenesis. And whether that's doing something to the gluten in the lumen to prevent it from getting in or breaking it down, whether that's helping the intestine to heal, whether that's blocking specific cytokines, specific inflammatory molecules that drive intestinal damage in celiac disease, or it's inducing tolerance, we should be able to target very specific parts of what makes celiac disease, and stop that without affecting the rest of the body. And I think this is really our goal with any medicine, right, is to be very specific, very targeted, control the disease without controlling all the other things your body needs to do to be healthy. So in my last slide, I think what is most exciting is not that there's any one of these that we should take home and say, this is my favorite, this drug is going to work, these drugs are not going to work. I think that if I'd given this talk even a couple years ago, most of these boxes, most of these types of therapies for celiac disease would be preclinical, if any, right? There'd be molecules in a lab, maybe in a mouse, but mostly in a test tube. But now we see across all of these major classes of celiac disease, we actually have drugs in the clinic that are being studied. So whether these are to prevent mucosal exposure from gliadin in the diet, and so whether that's things like enzymes, they also binding resins that bind up gluten. There's things that affect intestinal mucosal integrity to prevent gluten from getting through the cells into the lining. There's drugs that block deamidation, block the changing of gluten from something relatively non-toxic to relatively toxic that happens in the lining of the intestine. There are a few very exciting drugs, which we may hear a little bit about in a bit, that actually try to reset the immune system so it doesn't target gluten anymore. I mean, we're not born with celiac disease. It's something that you acquire later in life. And so if it's turned on, there's a switch that should be able to be turned off again. So this idea of being able to restore immune tolerance. We can actually prevent lymphocyte expansion, prevent that inflammatory reaction by, again, targeting very specific cytokines, predominantly in the mucosa of the intestine, and promoting villus repair, so helping the intestine heal after it's been damaged. And so in the darker red boxes, those are the ones that actually I'm working on specifically, and we have in clinical trials in my role at Takeda. The light box are ones that I also have in sort of the toolbox, but haven't brought personally into clinical trials yet, but may or may not have roles in the future depending on how everything else goes. So I think, clinical drug development is very challenging. It's among the most challenging research I've ever had the privilege of working on. There's just a lot of ways you can fail even if your drug is good. Wrong patients, wrong population, wrong endpoints, wrong doses. There's a lot of things. So you do see a very high failure rate. So we've seen some very encouraging drugs in the past make it almost to pivotal major trials in celiac disease and then not look so good, not be as effective as we thought they were in sort of in phase 2 trials. So I think one message is don't be discouraged. I feel like we're always saying the next drugs for celiac disease is going to be here in 5 years, and we keep saying that year after year. But really, I think now we have a critical mass with drugs in each of these. I think it's highly likely that at least one, and hopefully 3 or 4 of these will actually make it to market. And I think there's not going to be one drug that solves all problems for all patients with celiac disease. But I do think this is a very exciting time when we will actually have tangible treatments for celiac disease beyond the gluten-free diet for people who are not responding fully to dietary modification. And this is something that I think will really change the face of celiac disease for the future. So thank you, and I look forward to the panel discussion.
Thanks very much. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Kristen Neff, who's Vice President of Clinical Operations and Project Management at Immusante. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm your last speaker before we can talk, so I will try and keep it brief. I just want to be fully transparent here. You probably noticed that I'm the only one up here without a doctor in front of my name. I'm not a doctor. And thank you to all my esteemed panelists. I really enjoyed those presentations. I'm somebody who has spent my career developing medical devices and drugs for all different things. And this job that I have currently at Immusante is sort of the holy grail because Immusante is focused on autoimmune disorders, specifically celiac disease to start out with, but also type 1 diabetes. And both celiac disease and type 1 diabetes are in my family. So I have a lot of experience and I'm very committed to working on finding treatments for celiac disease and other autoimmune disorders. So Immusanti is a small biotech in Cambridge. We were founded in 2010, and our goal is to develop antigen-specific immunotherapies for autoimmune disease. So as we've already learned, celiac disease is a great place to start because we can actually trigger the immune response, unlike other autoimmune disorders. So we have developed something called NextVax2, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about it. We're studying it in celiac disease, and currently we have fast track designation from FDA in the USA for this particular treatment. Okay, so what is NextVax2? NextVax2 is actually a vaccine, and the goal of it is to protect against inadvertent gluten exposure for celiac patients who are on a gluten-free diet. So it's made of 3 peptides, and these peptides are designed to elicit an immune response in patients with celiac disease who specifically carry the HLA-DQ2.5 haplotype. It's delivered subcutaneously, and I have a little schematic in the middle of that slide that explains how we do this. So if anybody's familiar with allergy desensitization, this is very similar. So NextVax2 is delivered by injection. We start out at a very low dose of 1 microgram, and over the period of 5 weeks, with twice weekly dosing, we work up to our maintenance dose. So patients would go into the clinic to be dosed twice a week, increasing doses by a medical professional. And then they're put on a maintenance dose, which is the highest dose that we've studied, and it's 900 micrograms, and they can self-inject that using an auto-injector. So at that point, their treatment can be at home, continues twice weekly treatment, and then after about 6 months of treatment twice weekly, they can go into what we're calling more of a chronic maintenance phase, where they only have to dose once a week. And so the nice thing is they can use this auto-injector to self-administer at home. So the whole purpose of this is to prevent the T cells from this immune response that gluten causes, and hopefully allow the tissue to heal. So we really do believe this is a potentially disease-modifying therapeutic. So this is a very busy slide. You don't need to really look at the details, but what this shows you is that we have looked at this therapeutic in over 150 celiac disease patients to date. This is a series of phase 1 studies that we've done, and the phase 1 studies were really to determine that this is safe and tolerable to patients, and also to work on our dosing. And so that's what we've established, and one of the things we've used to help us with that is gluten challenges. So we have done studies in which we've challenged patients with gluten after they've been treated. So I'm just going to show you very quickly some information about one of the phase 1 studies that we did, where we treated patients with 150 micrograms of NextVax2 in a placebo-controlled blinded study, and we dosed them twice weekly for 8 weeks. And then after that, we gave them a 3-day gluten challenge. And at the top of the 2 boxes there is the patients who received NextVax2. So 6 of the 8 patients who received NextVax2 did not have a gluten response to gluten. And then for the placebo patients, actually only 3 of the patients were even able to complete the gluten challenge. The other ones could not tolerate the gluten due to severe symptoms. So we felt that this was very promising data. So where we are now is in a large phase 2 study that we're conducting in the US, Australia, and New Zealand. This is sort of a busy slide, but again, it's for protection against inadvertent gluten exposure for celiac patients who are on a gluten-free diet. We're studying this in a blinded, controlled fashion, and we start out our study with a gluten challenge so that we can determine if patients have symptoms as a result of gluten. We've heard that not all patients have symptoms, but it's important when we're studying this that patients have symptoms so we can actually see that they get better if the drug works. They then get randomized into either receiving NextVax2 or receiving placebo, and they go through that same dosing schema that I showed you in the previous slide. And then when they're in the maintenance phase, we're actually doing masked food challenges. So we're challenging these patients with either a gluten or a sham challenge to see what kind of responses they get. And our endpoint that we're looking at is what the patient's symptoms are on the first masked gluten challenge, first masked food challenge they have that contains gluten, as compared to baseline, which was before they started treatment. And so we've enrolled this study. We are working our way through the patients getting treated. We're hoping to complete the study and be able to announce our results by the end of the year. And then hopefully, if all goes well, we will be moving into a much larger series of phase 3 studies in which we will bring this treatment to Canada, as well as many other countries that will be looking to study Nexvax-2 as we sort of are on the march towards getting approval. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share this with you.
With that said, does any table want to pick a question that they came up with and throw it in the mix? You look pretty keen right to start with, so go ahead. Thank you.
Something that I was, hi, my name is Dan Feds, and I'm with Avena Foods. And one topic that caught my interest is the percentage of the population with celiac disease at 1% right now. I was wondering if there's any data that supports where this disease might be in the future, let's say in a 5 or 10 year time frame, if it's going to increase. We know that the increase right now is part of better diagnosis of the disease, but if the disease is actually increasing in people, I'd be interested in the answer to that.
Okay, Alice?
I'd say I think some of the best data we have is pediatric data, so I'll jump in. And so there's been some good prospective cohort studies, particularly the TEDdy study, which includes a site in Denver. And so what they've done is they've looked at their TEDdy population and extrapolated to the Denver population, and they estimate the prevalence of celiac disease is around 3% by age 15. And so that's definitely higher than we're seeing, and that's partly because it's extrapolating from active case finding. So definitely, there's nowhere to go but up.
Am I right in understanding that we're not sure what the cause is of that increase in prevalence? That's sort of some of the things I think Dr. Verdu you were speaking to?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly environmental, right? Oh, sorry, if you want to go ahead. But it's certainly environmental, right? Because we're not changing our genes, and it's why you do see this continual rise. You see interesting fluctuations of things over time in different populations where rates go up and then they go down again, and then they go up again and they go down again. So I don't know that we have a great understanding of what is causing that, but it's definitely something environmental.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree completely. And of course, my research is focused on the microbial side of that environmental component, but it wouldn't be the only one, right? So the environmental component from the point of view of microbes, it could be infections, it could be a change in your duodenal microbiome because of your style of life, because of the antibiotics you were taking, and so on. So it could be post-infectious. So that's all what we are doing at the basic research level in terms of microbial environmental factors.
You know, even in a country like India, where the last international meeting was, they quoted data where in different regions it's very high prevalence, other regions very low prevalence in a single country. So again, those things we don't understand. So there are regional variations, but I think overall, I think the incidence does seem to be increasing, which is independent of better diagnosis. Better diagnosis is obviously an issue and awareness, but this is a real increase. It appears to be in prevalence.
Okay, thanks. Who wants to bounce to the next question? Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Linda, and I moderate the Facebook page for the National Association. And one of the questions I have is I'm constantly seeing people saying that when they get gluten, sometimes they have a reaction in 15 minutes, sometimes they have a reaction in 10 hours, and then a lady posted this a couple of days ago, it's taking 3 to 4 days. And as celiac disease is a disease of the duodenum or upper intestine, my assumption is that obviously the gluten has to get that far. So Why is it some people react really fast and some people it takes them several hours before they start seeing a reaction? And what is a normal glutening reaction time?
So we looked at the data on this in our Manitoba cohort, and it's shocking that this is something that's very germane to people with celiac disease, but there's not a lot of published data. And we saw a signal that there's maybe 2 time points for reaction, but definitely very early reactions do happen, and I think maybe Kristen has something to say about that. And definitely we did see people who were reporting later reactions, and there you could imagine that these different reactions might have different mechanisms related to what part of the immune response or what part of duodenal damage is involved.
Hi, yes. We did a controlled study where we did a gluten challenge of 25 patients, and we looked at their symptoms for 6 hours after. And most people who had symptoms, because not everybody did, had symptoms peaking 2 to 3 hours after they had the gluten exposure. And the gluten exposure was a slurry that was vital wheat gluten. So we tried to eliminate the possibility of anything else causing a reaction like FODMAPs or something else. And it was equivalent to about 2 slices of wheat bread. And then by 6 hours, most of the patients had their symptoms go back to their baseline. But in the current study we're doing, we've done this same gluten challenge on over 300 patients. We haven't yet looked at the data, but we will be, and so we will be able to share all that with you. But that's what we saw. Of course, we only measured symptoms up to 6 hours, so that's not going to capture patients that have the later symptoms.
I think the one other thing I would just add quickly to that is for all GI diseases, we have a very poor understanding of what drives symptoms. And there is no good correlation between the degree of intestinal damage you have and the degree of symptoms you have at diagnosis or in follow-up. And I think that's often a misconception. So I think that explains why you can have these early reactions, which are well before you could have any visible, under the microscope at least, intestinal damage, but still significant symptoms, and vice versa.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, my name's Sarah Shaw. I'm a physician, and I have celiac disease myself, as well as the mother of boys with celiac disease. And I see a huge variation in our family in how people present in terms of reactions to celiac disease, reactions to gluten. Do we know anything about, does the intensity of an acute reaction to gluten tell us anything about incidence of complications down the road from celiac disease? Do we know anything about that?
That's a good question.
Stumped her.
I think you've stumped the group.
question.
But my sense would be no, is that there is not going to be a significant relationship, because I think there is good evidence that what drives your risk of long-term complications is the degree of intestinal damage and the duration of having that intestinal damage. And this is why, unfortunately, we see people who show up for the first time getting diagnosed with a complication and they've never noticed symptoms before. So I think in many ways you could actually argue the opposite, that having severe reactions to gluten could be protective against long-term complications, because you do get that negative feedback. But that's purely conjecture, and I have no data to really support that.
And you have subclinical, maybe you can comment on that, subclinical cases with complete atrophy, right? So
You're right. You have people who feel fine walking down the street with severe intestinal damage, and they are at risk for complications. So I think symptoms are on a different axis than complications.
I'd like a question that stumps the panel, so.
So we had 2 themes kind of come up, so I'll go with one of them for now. In terms of the studies, how hard is it to recruit people to participate in these studies? And what are maybe some ways for us to come up with some fundraising ideas to help you get funding to fund these programs? And where are we sourcing young investigators, or where are we inspiring them?
So there's definitely 3 questions there, so why don't we try them one at a time?
Yeah, I'll start with the first on recruiting patients. So interestingly, it's not as easy as you would think it is, and that's primarily because there are a lot of self-diagnosed celiac disease patients or celiac disease patients that haven't gone through sort of the gold standard for diagnosis, which is the serology and the biopsy that shows villus atrophy. We did a campaign where we advertised, and we got about 1,500 responses across the US. And of all those, once you sort of filtered out patients who were qualified and who were willing to be in the study, I think we got 7 actually in the study. That was in the US. In Australia, we had a much better, much faster enrollment rate. I think there are definitely regional differences in how people approach celiac disease and also with the healthcare. So we did much better in Australia and New Zealand than we did in the US.
You need to come to Canada.
So may I comment on the young investigator issue, because I have personal feelings towards that. So it's extremely difficult to recruit new investigators for a research career in celiac disease and to keep them in that. And one of the main reasons is lack of funding. And you will have also mentors that are going to discourage you and will tell you you are not going to get funded. Don't do celiac research, do IBS or do IBD. And this is something that really you can help us with. And with fundraising and also, lobbying CHR, for example. CHR in general thinks that celiac disease is not a primary interest, that other GI diseases are more important, and then you are competing with cardiovascular, obesity. I mean, obesity is the baby of stop eating, if you let's leave it there. So really, it's really important that you are engaged with lobbying for this, because we have a need here for engaging more people and getting into celiac disease research.
Yeah, and then just to underlie all that, I mean, I think the biggest thing that we need organizations to do is really make the case strongly to governments and others that there is a large unmet medical need in celiac disease. Because if you guys keep saying that, then everyone else will take note, from the researchers, from the medical students or the PhD students who hear that, to the government agencies who will then be able to fund research, but also support a new therapy when it comes available. So the louder you can keep saying that message, and the more you can support data from your own communities that says that, the more important that's going to be, and it's going to help sort of raise all boats.
I just say quickly, as somebody who operates on both sides of the border, that we really need more Canadians, because Canadians are great people, and we definitely have more success with our research studies in Canada than we do in the United States for various reasons. And we also need lobbying. So recently in the United States, one of the celiac disease associations spoke to Congress about the lack of research funding for celiac disease, and now one of the institutes of the NIH has been tasked with coming up with a plan to give more money to celiac disease. And so I think these initiatives are really important, and lobbying happens all the time. You can't stop. The message has to keep coming and coming and coming, and find those people who are your natural allies and work with them.
Can I add just one thing? So recently we had some politician meetings with politicians about DG2 in Ontario and coverage. And we really faced a wall with that. They have no understanding. So really, we need you to go and speak with these people and tell them how important this is. If we don't diagnose the disease, we cannot treat them, and you will have down the road healthcare burden, costs. And they don't see this. They think it's still a benign disease with no consequences.
Just one last thing. I think we're sometimes the victims of our own success, so that I think for a lot of my colleagues even, they feel that celiac disease is quite straightforward. People have symptoms, I make a biopsy, we make the diagnosis, we treat them, they're done. It's finished. And I think we have to take it the next step, and we have to use Jocelyn's theme of the fact that we have all the questions. In fact, there's many, many to answer, and I think we have to highlight the ones that are relevant, and that has to be highlighted to our colleagues, it has to be highlighted to funding agencies. And we have to make it very clear that this isn't a disease which is just you get symptoms, you get diagnosed, you go on a gluten-free diet, and you're fine. We have to move beyond that. And so, again, we like to put a positive spin on this condition, how there are some advantages to treating it, but I think we have to really highlight the things that still need to be accomplished, and there's much to accomplish yet.
Okay, so over here, and then there's a hand up over here. So go ahead.
Thank you. Katie Jensen from Beyond Celiac. I'm going to pivot a little from this conversation about patient advocacy and the patient voice. What we talked about at our table was these most promising therapies that are coming up, which are very exciting. And it seems like most of them protect against accidental gluten exposure, but some of us are wondering, is there a world 10, 20 years down the road where a patient can take a pill and eat a pizza or not have to worry about the gluten-free diet?
So
It's on your shoulders, Dan.
I think, and Kristen, I'd be interested in your take on it. I think that is scientifically achievable, although it's maybe more than 10 or 20 years down the road. I think as big a question as is how you would do it is who would pay for it? Because, treating people who don't have well-controlled celiac disease, I think is clearly a demonstrable medical need. Allowing people to eat pizza is not as clearly, a medical need that the government or whoever should shoulder, right? And I think it's really a matter of prioritization of healthcare resources. That being said, if the right treatment came along and you really did have a durable cure, so to speak, I think it would be very interesting to see what kind of conversations we could bring up about long-term disease management versus, a full cure. But I think that's as big a hurdle is sort of this societal burden as much as it is scientific reality.
Thank you. I agree with that 100%. In the U.S., of course, the payer aspect is very important. But for NextVax2 specifically, it was a negotiation with regulatory agencies to come up with our indication, which is protection against inadvertent gluten exposure. We would like to think that it's possible that this treatment could work in a gluten diet, but we're starting very small, and we're trying to show this in a very specific indication, and then if we achieve that, we can see where we can take it.
And I would just add that I'm not sure that that's the question we should be asking. And so as pediatricians, we know who's going to get celiac disease. It's people with DQ2 and DQ8. And we don't think they're born with celiac disease. And so we're starting to ask the question, what's that point where you've gone past the point of no return and you've got celiac disease? Is there a point where you've started celiac disease, but we can get that horse back in the barn? And so what about preventing celiac disease?
Okay. Margaret Duthie from Quebec. There's a couple of things I'd like to bring up. I hope I can put them right. I'm very interested, since last year especially, when we had Dr. Hadji Vassiliou talking about neurological symptoms, because my husband does some volunteer work with people who have got mental illness but can manage on their own and are living in sheltered accommodation. And when I see these people from time to time, I'm really struck with the fact that I'm wondering how many of them who've got diagnoses of depression, schizophrenia, these sorts of things, would really benefit if they, their quality of life might be improved if they got a diagnosis of celiac disease. And I've started muttering about, the TTG test is free in Quebec, it's worth doing. But I'm wondering if this would be of interest for a young investigator as a reward, if I could interest people at the Montreal General who have a research centre. So that was the first thing I was bringing up, to see if the prevalence was higher among that group, because it's a small group that you could look at. And second of all, to study what happened when they went on the gluten-free diet, how measure their quality of life to some extent. So that's one thing. But the other thing is that there's a research group, and I think it's called the Campbell Collaboration, and the editor I know is in Ottawa, because she's my goddaughter, and they do evidence-based research all across the world, and how much I think researchers are linking up across the world about celiac disease, and you have the international conference. But how much are you linking with people like that, especially as they seem to be quite strong in Canada? Because there's also a huge need to get this information about the celiac disease to all the healthcare professionals, not just doctors, nurses, preposés in residences and hospitals, social workers, psychologists, everybody, because we see people, we see that they're not responding to other sorts of treatment, and they at least encourage them to do the TTG test. So I'm just wondering about your reactions to those things that have been coming through my mind. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you know about this group?
Yeah, as far as that collaboration group, I don't know about that. I mean, collaboration is one of those words that we like to pursue, and we think that there's great value in collaborating, whether it's amongst people in Canada or internationally in North America. So I think we're looking for any opportunity we can to collaborate and to join expertise, if you like. And some of that expertise may be people that aren't necessarily experts in celiac disease, but let's say in epidemiology, and sort of bring them into the celiac fold. So I think those are opportunities that we certainly think about and like to cultivate. And if we can leverage, even from if I put a CCA hat on, if we can leverage some of our funding to support some of that, I think that'd be something that we would support for sure.
And there was a question about linkage between mental illness and celiac.
So with respect, you are absolutely right. There is a group in UK, very good group, that investigates directly central nervous system alterations, in celiac disease. They show that some of those abnormalities can regress, others not. It's a point of no return. So some CNS symptoms can be improved if early diagnosis is done, and the importance of having TG2 available and screening people if they are at risk. And then there is a group in Columbia University, and we have done some retrospective studies as well in our clinic, and there is a relationship. Now, the problem we face here in Ontario is if we cannot make the diagnosis, how can we identify those people? And those people that are in those institutions, many times they cannot pay for the test if they are not within a hospital setting. So again, going back to lobbying, and getting this disease diagnosed.
Okay. So we'll go here, and then we'll get you over there.
Hi, my name is Julie Green, and I'm with the Board of Directors for the CCA, but this is a question I'm asking on behalf of myself. Just wondering what neurological research is happening in Canada right now, if any, and how we can better connect with that community to encourage research in the future.
As far as neurology and celiac disease in Canada, I don't know of anybody that's really taken that on. I don't know if anybody else does. I think the UK is where a lot of the research has been done, and as we found out last year at the annual meeting. I know that locally, certainly in Manitoba, the neurologists are aware of celiac disease, so from a clinical point of view, I think people recognize that association, although it's perhaps under-recognized for sure in general. And so I think there's an awareness piece that needs to be dealt with. I think taking it to a research level is another level, and that's looking at some of the reasons behind this and some of the responses, et cetera. So I wouldn't say that I think in Canada, we're more at the area of, at a clinical level, are people aware that these associations exist and trying to, and I think that was one of the reasons of highlighting neurology at last year's meeting, was to try and get at that piece a little bit more.
And as I mentioned in the previous question, so we are doing some studies in neuropsychiatric. So it's more depression, anxiety, rather than neurological, because we are a gastroenterology center, right? But those studies are not easy to get funded.
Okay, my question, Joanne Dawhart from PEI chapter. Would you see any advantage to lobbying government for standardized or mandatory testing of children? I believe this takes place in other countries. Would that be an advantage to your research?
So I'll jump in on that one. We actually, several of us earlier this week were at the Digestive Disease Week conference, and there was actually a debate about screening for celiac disease. And the issue is that there's really not the evidence to support it. There is a large study happening again in Denver where they're doing population-based screening in the teenage years. I think, well, it might be helpful to have the celiac patients identified. What's also helpful is for the celiac disease patients not to get a diagnosis and disappear. And so we need patients to come back to clinic so that we know how you're doing. In Children's Hospital in Boston, we lose half our patients within 3 years of diagnosis. And so we really don't know the long-term impact. But right now, I think screening is probably not quite ready for prime time.
Hi, me again.
Sorry, just 1 second, there's a little piped up corollary to that question, but just before we go there.
Sorry, there's a question about
why
why do we lose our patients and why are they not coming for follow-up? And we want to look further into this, and we're looking at collaborating with our colleagues across the country. I think what's interesting is that the signal we saw was that the people who were coming were the ones who were doing better. And I think it's because what's the incentive of coming to see me if you're going to tell me that you're getting gluten and you're not feeling very well, and I'm going to say, well, you have to do a better job on a gluten-free diet. Versus, and I'm not going to offer you a new medication, I'm not going to offer you something different, so why are you spending the hours in traffic and paying for parking and taking a day off work when there might be a perception of, what are we getting from these visits? Also, I think there's a question about what's the proper interval for follow-up. We really don't have data on when or how often people should be followed for celiac disease. And I think there's the people who are coming are the folks who have normalized their TTG, who are feeling better, who are getting some positive reinforcement that they're doing the right thing. And I'm not sure those are the patients we need to see.
Interesting. Okay. So, sorry. Now go ahead.
Okay. Testing in kids and adults. So a child, baby, what age has their intestine developed enough to have a proper TTG test done? We know that there's the protocol for children to be able to have the genetic test and the 2 TTG tests and not to have the endoscopy. And is there also a protocol like that for adults being developed? So it's a double-edged question.
So I'll take the easy one because that's a pediatric question and leave the adult question for somebody else. So in terms of when do children develop celiac disease, really we don't see celiac disease before gluten. So we're typically looking later in the first year of life. In terms of our patients in our clinic with family risk, we usually, if there's no symptoms, start screening around age 2. But it definitely depends on the patient and when the siblings or parents were diagnosed. And we will do endoscopy in the NICU. So we recommend endoscopy for our patients because we feel that's the standard and it's a lifelong diagnosis with lifelong consequences, and the only good time to make a diagnosis is before there's been a gluten-free diet. And so we will do endoscopy routinely on kids who are 1 year old to 2 years old.
So in adults, the protocol is still to biopsy everybody. That is the goal. There was just a study published out of New York, the Columbia group in this last month's gastroenterology journal, which looked at a database where they found that 20% of people were not getting biopsies in sort of this sample. So there's substantial numbers that don't get biopsies, and I would certainly think that the practice I see that would probably be a number that would be correct. There's been some studies that suggest that maybe in adults you don't need to, but that hasn't been adopted because the pediatric literature, it hasn't really been adopted in North America or even in Europe as far as I know. So that biopsy is still considered to be the gold standard, and I think that's still something that the message we still want to send out. And the other message that goes along with that is the message of keep eating gluten until you get tested. And that's something that we suffer from a lot, that until we have good challenge studies where we have a simple test perhaps that avoids, is a very short challenge, this is really a message that we need to get across. Yeah.
Dawn, I was just going to ask, we as dietitians constantly get patients, and this is what I hear from my colleagues all over North America, is that because of the waiting list to see to get their endoscopy. People are just going on the gluten-free diet, or the family doctors are just saying, okay, your TTG's positive, go ahead. And I'm not sure how we deal with that because of a colorectal screening and the emphasis of the time for you as gastroenterologists that celiac's kind of, well, just go on the diet. It's not a big deal to get diagnosed. And we preach on the CCA about why, all the reasons you should stay on the diet and wait to get diagnosed. But the reality is, and Linda sees it all the time on the Facebook page, I see it too and hear it, is that they don't want to keep staying sick. And so we have a challenge. I'm not sure if you have any comments there. And the second one I wanted to say, Jocelyn, I'm not sure in the States if we had any data between the US and Canada of the number of patients that are actually getting referred to a dietitian, because I did do a study, an online survey with dietitians before I spoke at the NIH conference years ago in like early 2000, and what we found in the US was that the patient wasn't seeing a dietitian because the insurance companies say they only pay for treatment. And I looked at the panel and said, but the treatment for celiac disease at this stage, that was well before we had drugs and in the pipeline, was a gluten-free diet. So I think we got a double problem, getting people to dietitians and also to the doctors for the screening. I just wonder if you want to comment on that and the differences in the US and Canada.
Sure. No, I think endoscopy resources is definitely an issue, and that's an issue across Canada where there is this delay between positive serology and when you can actually access an endoscopy. The Canadian Association of Gastroenterology has guidelines that have set up that this should be done within 2 months. I don't think that's happening. So it's an area we've talked about at the PAC level. It's another area of advocacy to prioritize this, because I think people do go down the path of, if I'm going to wait 9 months and I'm feeling lousy, then I'm going to start going gluten-free. So definitely something that is something that needs to be addressed. I think, again, there's regional differences. In many centers, I know it's certainly in Alberta and in Manitoba, we've got a centralized intake where people get referred to a central place where they get their scope done. When you're dealing with that process, you do have the ability to actually prioritize. And so in Manitoba, we do prioritize, and we tend to get them within about 2 months. But I know there's a lot of places that aren't like that. So I think there's work to be done. And again, the challenge is in Canada is you have, different provinces have different setups, and trying to get a system that will actually prioritize this is difficult. And you're right, the perception out there is that this is not as important an issue as screening for colon cancer, let's say, or some other GI issues.
So just before you ask your question, I've also got Inez there. And then folks at tables where nobody's asked a question yet, I'm going to be coming around to you for the next. So, okay, so table 3, table 11. Okay, so we're going to set it up. If nobody at your table has stuck their hand up yet, you're just heads up.
So I won't get too much into my personal journey to diagnosis, but I will comment that many family physicians have limited knowledge on celiac disease. So you're all doing amazing work, and how can we get that information to the family physicians in Ontario or Canada?
Again, this issue comes up in the last 3 years. This is on our agenda frequently at our PAC meetings. I think there's no one simple solution. We're starting to get involved with the annual meeting of the Canadian Family Physicians. So, for instance, last year we had a booth. This next year we're going to have a presentation at that meeting. So it's things like that we think will impact family docs. I know that in universities, celiac disease is being covered more now in terms of medical school curriculum. So that's another one. The paradox in my mind is, and again, then we have a problem in Ontario where family docs can't screen for it, which is a big problem. I think when the incentive, or one of the attractive things from a primary care point of view is, this is a condition where a primary care physician could screen for it, they can identify a condition that's actually treatable, that makes their patient feel better. It's ideal. Like, it's the ideal condition for primary care to get involved in. And they could also be participants in the follow-up for sure. So it's a very attractive condition in my mind for family docs, but it takes a great educational effort to do this. And you're absolutely right. I still see a lot of anecdotes. I know locally there are referrals I get from a cluster of family docs that have that are sensitive to this, and they're picking it up, and there's clearly a lot of that aren't there. We think that the iceberg is getting less, but there's a ways to go. But we're very aware that this is an issue, for sure.
Okay.
If I could just jump back and answer
Sure.
Shelley's question. She'd asked about seeing dietitians in the United States. And it is true that a lot of insurance coverage doesn't cover dietitians because there's really only 2 approved indications, and celiac disease isn't one of them. When we reviewed our data, I was delighted to see that 83% of our patients see one of the dietitians in our own institution following diagnosis for education on celiac disease. In terms of endoscopy, I work in a very overserviced area in Boston, and we have 3 centers doing pediatric endoscopies almost every day of the week. And I would say that from first TTG at primary care to diagnostic endoscopy in my pediatric patients is typically more than 2 months.
Okay, you want to jump the queue? Sure.
My name is Inez. I'm a clinical dietitian. I work at the Hospital for Sick Children. Thank you all. I'm super excited to be here. My questions relate to the Facebook question that was addressed. So at the Hospital for Sick Children right now, we have adopted what's called the EASPGAN criteria to minimize endoscopic usage. So EASPGAN stands for the European Society for Pediatric Gastroenterology, Hepatology, and Nutrition. And it was led by Dr. Sybil Koletsko and a big group of colleagues in Europe looking at could you potentially diagnose celiac disease without the gold standard endoscopy. And it was to address the facts that there's long wait times and that potentially it could be done. So to that question that the individual had asked, it's out there, but it's not something that we do for most of our patients. Most of our patients are still going through the endoscopy. So if anyone's interested, there certainly is the criteria that's out there for pediatrics. We use it ever so often in children typically that are very, very sick, admitted under the age of 2. Don't necessarily want to put them through endoscopy, especially if they have other conditions that are associated with celiac disease, like trisomy 21 or Down syndrome. So just to say it's out there and floating, but it's still not something that's utilized throughout many pediatric centers. The other point around screening young children that often comes up in our center too, the question around should you start screening young, and we address this by also saying that there's issues around knowing about IgA status. So we know if we're screening and we're using IgA TTGs, if you have children under the age of 2 where their immune system hasn't fully evolved and developed, you potentially could have not a true IgA deficient patient, but just someone where you can't rely on TTGs. So even though the family will tell you that their infant's been exposed to gluten, you might not get that response that you're looking for. So we just have to be cognizant of that as well. And then to address the issues around dietetic resources. So I've been working at Sick Kids for well over a decade. Every patient that is diagnosed with celiac disease gets access to me, yay. But that is a hugely underserviced area in Ontario where I can speak to many families that reach out to us to try to get more dietetic support and to try to educate dietitians around gluten-free treatment. So I have a little pet peeve. I don't like calling it a diet. It's a complete lifestyle change that we all know has other psychosocial impact and concerns. So in addition to advocating for Young Investigators Awards, clinicians, medical community to get involved, we need Dietitians of Canada to also support education and to get dietitians involved in more research because there's a huge gap in that knowledge and area as well. So.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so over here, and then table 3 is next, and then other tables where hands have not gone up yet. Oh, the table 4 after that. Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name is Brittany. I'm from Nova Scotia. My family and I opened the first certified gluten-free food program restaurant. So I've worked in the industry, and my question is related to how we said that everything is different reactions. And I'm wondering because we have a lot of people who come in who have dairy allergies, and they say it goes hand in hand. So how much has that been sort of looked into, and where the gluten-free products on the market, as we all know, have changed a lot over the years, but not always the best tasting. They've done a lot of additives of sugars and stuff. Is that possibly reason why everybody's having different outcomes? Can it all be related to sugars and other areas of allergies?
So you're asking about sort of the interaction between celiac and potential other allergies or irritants, insensitivities. Okay. And I'm also curious, just for the industry panelists who are coming next, I think that it might be interesting to take that question up again here, but I'll send it over to the panelists.
So the way I would answer that question is that gastroenterologists have known for a long time that many different components can induce symptoms. So just because on a wheat-containing diet someone reacts doesn't mean that they are celiac. And celiac people could react to other components in wheat that are not necessarily, I mean, these things could overlap, IBS and celiac disease. So I'm not sure what the question is in terms of whether your clients are asking you whether they could have some reaction to the products you sell. Is that the question? I didn't.
Well, so like we have people that say they have dairy allergies as well as
Okay.
gluten allergies.
Yes.
So does it go more hand in hand? Like they saying that?
So there's no, the clinicians will answer that, but there's no reason why a person with celiac disease or without celiac disease would not have also allergy towards, for example, milk proteins. But it could also be an intolerance to the sugars in milk, okay? And that could be secondary to someone having, for example, a lesion due to celiac disease. But those are conditions that can be diagnosed in a hospital or in a clinic, and so I would definitely refer them there, you know.
Right. So the literature says about a quarter of people with celiac disease will have at least one other food intolerance beyond gluten. Most of those, though, are not true IgE-mediated food allergies. They're more, lactose or something else, but it is heterogeneous, and I think celiac disease doesn't exclude any other food intolerance. I think your other question about the processed foods is also probably true. I think a lot of people don't do well when a lot of their diet, celiac or not, to be honest, when a lot of their diet is built around processed foods. And I think getting people back to sort of more sort of natural foods in general is a good rule for anyone, celiac or not.
Yeah, and just to add to the whole milk story, in terms of lactose intolerance, newly diagnosed patients may be lactose intolerant because they have villus destruction and they've lost the enzyme. When that recovers, they may develop the ability again to digest milk and milk products and dairy products. So it's always worth re-challenging people as long as it's not a true allergy. If it's more of an intolerance, 6 months, a year down the road to see if they can tolerate dairy products.
I have a question here. So my name is Ashley. I'm a member of the Celiac community in Toronto, and I volunteer at the Toronto chapter. So I've heard you talk a lot about children, but I'm curious as a woman that's thinking of pregnancy, like what do women with celiac disease need to be mindful of if they're thinking of pregnancy? Also, two more, questions to build on that. Effects of gluten exposure on a fetus, as well, would NextVax be an effective mechanism for prospective mothers maybe to lessen the effects of accidental gluten exposure?
So the literature on this is actually quite confusing, but I think that what is very clear is that women with active celiac disease at the time of pregnancy do have smaller babies, they have more intrauterine growth retardation, they have a higher risk of some adverse reactions to gluten, to adverse birth outcomes, higher risk of C-section, things like that. Beyond that, the more severe things, congenital malformations, don't appear to be associated. Risk of miscarriage is unclear. You have studies showing in either direction. But certainly, even from that, small for gestational age is a perfectly good reason to want to make sure your celiac disease is well controlled. So I do think it's actually pre-child planning is potentially one time in which it would be interesting to conduct a celiac disease screening study. There is at least one big fertility practice in the Boston area that now screens all their patients for celiac disease and have had some really interesting outcomes from that, positive outcomes from diagnosing. So for me, there's not a clear guideline that I'm aware of for what testing and what to do with women who have celiac disease who are planning to have a baby. And I don't know, Dawn, if you know anything. What I do in my practice, though, is I do like to make sure they are seronegative, so a normalized TTG for, not that that's the most useful test, but I think it's pretty good. Sometimes I will it's a good excuse to do a biopsy ahead of the pregnancy if I'm at all unsure about their disease status. And I'll do an extended nutritional screen and probably have them see the dietitian one more time just to make sure folate and B12 and iron or everything else is as optimized as it can be. But the good news is that with women with well-controlled celiac disease, pregnancy outcomes are just as good as with anyone else.
I'd just like to add to that before we talk about the NextVax2 aspect of your question, that one of the areas of research that's really not well known is we know from other autoimmune conditions that because your immune system actually changes during pregnancy because you have to tolerate a fetus, the actual changes and shifts in your immune system during pregnancy affect your susceptibility to different immune conditions through the course of pregnancy and postpartum. And we don't have a good sense of how that affects risk for onset of celiac disease.
And regarding NextVax2, we have not yet studied it in pregnant women, and I'm sure you know that that's a very special category when you're developing new drugs, but it is very much on our radar screen because we all know 80% of patients with celiac disease are women, and many are in the childbearing years. We have no reason to believe that NextVax2 would cause any genital deformations because it's not a high-risk drug, but we will have to study it specifically in that patient population, and that would not come until further on down the drug development path.
Shelley Case again. Question about that we get asked a lot is women that have celiac disease, the baby's born, they have a sibling that one of their children already has celiac, and the question they ask is when can we introduce gluten to that infant that doesn't have celiac disease, and how much? Because we know we've gone all over, and you can comment about the breastfeeding too, because I'm sure people would want to know about that.
Thank you. So I think this is a great question, and there was a sort of Swedish celiac epidemic, which was thought to be related to changing in feeding practices, which is why there were some large prospective clinical trials looking at feeding practices. And there hasn't really been a good signal. It makes sense there's probably some signal that the amount of gluten you have maybe affects your risk of developing celiac disease, and that's probably more of a probabilistic thing. There's some data that perhaps rotavirus vaccine may decrease the risk of developing celiac disease. In our clinics, we recommend that families don't take any special precautions when introducing gluten. And we really know what we've learned from allergy is that there's a window for tolerance. And so we recommend introducing solid foods between 4 and 6 months. I do counsel my patients that, of course, if they were to never give the child gluten, then maybe they could prevent celiac disease. But I'm not sure what the point of that is. And so most of my families choose to give their children gluten. I think a lot of them end up being on a low gluten diet by default if there's another family member in the house with celiac disease, just because there's less gluten around.
And one interesting hypothesis from the research point of view is that all those studies showing that, it doesn't matter too much when you introduce gluten in children, but that perhaps the high amount, together with an infection, that would be, a trigger for breaking the tolerance. So these are the interactions that are interesting in terms of research.
So we have time for one more quick question. If you still have questions that you would like to ask, please mark them down on the sheets on your table. And then we'll have one more question, then we'll break. And so the answers will also have to be a little efficient.
Sure, sounds good. I don't even know if I have much of a question, but my name's Jessica. I'm a dietitian at the Stella Children's Hospital in Edmonton. I work closely with Justine Turner and Dinah Major. I want to speak a little bit to Inez's point about dietitian, and I guess Shelley's point about dietitian access. Definitely in Edmonton, we are seeing that we have increased numbers of children being diagnosed with celiac disease, and last year was our highest ever, and I think it will just continue going up. We diagnosed 208 kids last year. And they do have dietitian access to come and see myself and another GI dietitian, and we have studied and published the need for multidisciplinary care in specifically pediatric celiac disease, but all celiac disease in terms of access to a dietitian. But we are finding that our funding is quite limited. Like we have long wait lists to come back and see us in our clinics. We service all of Alberta, northern BC, northern Saskatchewan in parts, and territories. And so what we are trying to do is we've moved towards group teaching. We're doing a lot of like group teaching with newly diagnosed families, and it does offer a nice positive peer support situation as well. And we did receive a grant this year, which we're actively working on creating online modules to do some education and teaching for those who perhaps want a refresher, or they live outside of Edmonton or outside of our community that we serve. So we are trying to address these needs in different ways as well with our limited resources, and we'll see how well that takes us. If I could ask a question to the panel, I would ask whether there is a possibility of education perhaps in conjunction with the CCA, to alternative healthcare providers that our patients do see before or after they see us. We have a lot of patients who seek out chiropractic medicine, naturopathic medicine, those kinds of things, and they often come back and see us and they say, well, my naturopath said I was cleared of my celiac disease, I don't have it anymore. Or my doctor that I saw in my home country says that I've been gluten-free for a year, I'm fine, I can go back on it now. And so I'm wondering if there is a role for us to play in that, or whether it would just fall on deaf ears.
So I wonder if, I think some of that, the answer to that question might come from the CCA itself. And also I think it might be something we might explore in the last panel of the day with dietitians. So I'm wondering if I'm not sure if there's a research-related answer to that. That sounds more like it's sort of advocacy and sort of relationships with other associations and so on. Does that make sense? But I don't. Is there a research response to that in terms of sort of allopathic practitioners?
The education of physicians. Education.
Yeah. Physicians and anyone else that patients might see.
I think the only research response would be to the first part of what you're saying related to gluten-free diet education. And I think that we have been using more traditional one-on-one methods, and we don't know that that's the best method for gluten-free diet education. Our colleagues at Children's National in Washington, D.C. actually have a gluten-free resource center app, which is full of useful things. There's podcasts, there's recipes, and they actually do online interactive gluten-free diet classes. And so I think there's other ways of reaching people, and we really need to work on what's the best way, because it may not be coming to the medical center and seeing the dietitian one-on-one.
Thanks. Wonderful. So thank you all. I'm sure there are other questions left over, so I'm hoping you'll write those down. So I hope you'll join me in thanking the panelists very much for an interesting talk.